Today's episode discusses a case that involves accusations of domestic violence that some may find disturbing. While I will avoid any graphic depictions, listener discretion is advised. On a warm winter night in Central Florida, 22-year-old LaTonya Roberts was preparing for a night out. She called up her sister and asked if she wanted to come along to a local club, but her sister wasn't up for it. This would be the last time anyone would ever hear from LaTonya. 2 days later, her father would locate her abandoned vehicle parked a half-mile from the club she'd planned to go to. Something wasn't right, though. LaTonya was a petite 4 feet 11 inches and sat on a seat cushion when she drove. Yet when her car was found, the driver's seat was pushed all the way back and the cushion was on the wrong seat. Had someone else driven the young woman's car to that spot, and if so, what became of the bright and talented medical assistant? LaTonya's sisters would quickly tell investigators a disturbing story, one of abuse, control, and domestic violence that culminated in a deeply traumatizing event when LaTonya was forced, at gunpoint, to stand in front of a shallow grave. It was a warning of what could come to pass. And then, less than a month later, LaTonya vanished. Was it a coincidence or a threat being paid in full? This is Trace Evidence, episode 231, The Disappearance of LaTonya Roberts. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. In today's episode, we examine the mysterious disappearance of LaTonya Roberts from Orlando, Florida in December of 1994. Now, without further ado, this is episode 231, The Disappearance of LaTonya Roberts. Despite the oppressive humidity of the sticky Florida night air, LaTonya Roberts struggled to contain the rippling tremor of a chilled shiver crawling down her spine. Her breathing was shallow, her heartbeat rapid, as she stood beneath a sky so blackened by cloud cover that there was no distinguishing where the horizon ended and the sky began. Still, she stood frozen in the cold grasp of fear amidst the clinking leaves and swirling sand of a darkened citrus grove. Heavy footsteps carried her deeper into the grove, the buzzing cut of traffic fading into the quiet stillness of a grim and haunting night. Behind her hulked a larger figure, determined and burning with anger. He urged the young woman forward with frustrated grunts, and where his voice might fail to capture command, the gun in his hand made up for the difference and ensured quiet compliance. Suddenly, the man called out and LaTonya came to a stop, standing still as she could with the threat of a gunshot lingering in the darkness behind her. Emerging from the shadows, the man walked around a dark patch of the earth and gestured towards it with the gun. LaTonya looked down to see she was standing on the edge of a hole dug into the dirt of the citrus grove. It wasn't a large hole by any means, but as the armed man made it clear, the hole wouldn't need to be very large to fit LaTonya's petite body inside of it. And that, he promised, was exactly what would happen if she ever crossed him again. Pointing the gun at the young woman, he explained how he wouldn't hesitate to finish the job, and with him wielding the shovel, no one would find her. Ever. That night, LaTonya would make it back home to sleep in her own bed, but the trauma of having her life threatened point blank by someone she not only trusted but cared for wasn't something that was going to just fade away. It was a traumatic experience most people can't imagine, to stand in the darkness wondering if these will be your last moments on Earth, and that decision is in someone else's hands. They were words that stuck with her, ones that she shared selectively with her sisters, but feared to tell others about. The story of that horrible night would remain a terrible secret for the next few weeks. But when LaTonya mysteriously disappeared less than a month later, those who loved her couldn't help but wonder if the gunman had made good on his threats. Nearly 30 years later, and LaTonya's family still fights to find their missing sister and daughter and to deliver justice to the person responsible for her absence. LaTonya Diane Roberts was born on Tuesday, October 10th, 1972 to parents Virgil and Ernestine in Broward County, Florida. LaTonya was the Roberts' second-born daughter, and the couple would go on to have more girls, rounding out a family full of girls spread apart in age by no more than 6 years. According to friends and family, LaTonya was a sweet, fun-loving little girl who adored spending time playing with her sisters. She's been described as never fitting into any particular box as a child. She loved playing with her dolls and dressing up just as much as riding her bike and digging her fingers into the lush Florida soil. One area in which LaTonya and all of her sisters excelled at was music, specifically singing. Their father, Virgil, was a Pentecostal preacher, and as such, the girls were raised through the church. There, they quickly fell in love with singing in the choir, and their voices were, according to those who had the pleasure of hearing them sing, beautiful and vibrant. There was no doubt that when it came to the Roberts girls, they could sing their hearts out, and they had no problem getting parishioners up on their feet. Whether it was in church or just sitting around the family home laughing and having a good time, there was never a moment where the sisters weren't thrilled to sing and have fun together. Though LaTonya would spend the first half of her life in surrounding counties, the family would pick up stakes and head off in a new direction. Leaving from the Fort Lauderdale area of Florida's East Coast, they'd move more than 200 miles north, settling into central Florida in Orange County around 1984. Ultimately, they would purchase and move into a home along Casa Grande Drive, located in South Orlando adjacent to Cypress Grove Park. Virgil, the patriarch of the family, would continue working as a minister, taking on the lead at the Zion Temple Fire Baptized Holiness Church of God. In addition to his role in the ministry, Virgil also worked a full-time job as a custodian at nearby Palm Lake Elementary School on the city's west side. It was here in Orlando that LaTonya would live throughout her most formative years, transitioning into a teenager and beginning her studies at Oak Ridge High School. As LaTonya came into herself as a teenager, she found her world expanding. Her sweet and kind personality made her a magnet for friends, and throughout her high school years, she never wanted for one. As she grew older and leaned more into her femininity, the boys came calling. LaTonya was described by many suitors as a beautiful young woman with a smile that could charm even the most difficult of men and a laugh that could melt their hearts. As her sister Lolita would later tell the Spectrum News, quote, LaTonya had a beautiful smile, and she was always smiling, end quote. She was, without a doubt, the girl for whom heads turned when she entered the room. But LaTonya didn't allow herself to be distracted or pulled off course, and regardless of countless offers for dinner and dates, she focused on her studies with just as much vim and vigor as she had her social life. She had dreams, goals she wanted to achieve, and no one was going to stand in her way. While she wasn't shy about going out, she didn't put the dates before everything else. She had her priorities straight, and she wasn't shy about saying so. She went on to graduate from Oak Ridge in 1990, just a few months before her 18th birthday. Bright and with a sharp eye on the future, she didn't take any time off. That fall, she registered and enrolled at Orlando College, where she focused her major around both business and the medical field. As had been the case in everything she'd applied her mind to, LaTonya performed extremely well and achieved high grades throughout her classes. Wrapping up her schoolwork, she went out and started putting in job applications. It didn't take long to hear back, and within a few weeks she was hired on as a medical assistant at the PCA Family Medical Center. Not only was it a fantastic job that LaTonya was excited to take on, but it was also located less than 3 miles from the family home, making it a short and easy commute. Things couldn't possibly have been going better for the then 20-year-old. She had the entire world ahead of her, and she hadn't yet begun to scratch the surface of her goals. Everyone who knew her felt the same. There was nothing LaTonya couldn't do once she set her mind to it. By the fall of 1994, She'd been working at the medical center for 2.5 years and was considered one of their best and most reliable employees. In September of that year, her photo would appear in local papers after several articles were written up about medical policies and health insurance issues in the state. Unfortunately, the next time she appeared in the headlines, it would be as the focus of a desperate search for a missing sister and daughter. Now, as a quick aside, I should note that there are a number of factors about this case which seem to be reported inaccurately. When it comes down to the last day LaTonya was seen, there are 3 different dates given: Wednesday, December 14th, Friday, the 16th, and Sunday, the 18th. We know that the 18th is actually the day she was reported missing, with all official paperwork saying that she was last seen on Friday, the 16th. Where the 14th comes from, I couldn't tell you, and while it's listed on some missing person sites as the official date, Friday the 16th is what is listed on NamUs, as well as on all missing persons flyers that were handed out at the time. 2 detectives assigned to the case would also later state that Friday was the day of the disappearance. So, in the interest of clarity, we'll be utilizing the 16th as the last day LaTonya was seen by friends and family. Friday, December 16th was a warm, humid, and breezy day in Central Florida. Temperatures lingered in the mid to upper 60s, dipping into the 50s during the early morning hours. With sunrise coming in at just after 7 a.m., the commute to work was conducted in early morning darkness for most, including LaTonya. However, she was really looking forward to that day, and not just because it would usher in the weekend. In fact, it was that night in particular that she was pumped for, as her sister, Lolita, was going to be singing the national anthem before a basketball game at her former high school. LaTonya was extremely supportive and loving to her sisters, and so with Lolita having this honor, LaTonya was probably more excited for her younger sister than she was for herself. Arriving at the school with a video camera in hand, or to be time appropriate, mounted on her shoulder, LaTonya was there to support her sister and capture the moment on tape. According to Lolita, singing went extremely well, and she and her sister celebrated together afterwards with lots of hugs and excited praise. The 2 sisters sat down together in the bleachers as the game started. They chatted casually about nothing in particular, just checking in on one another and sharing whatever came to mind. During this conversation, LaTonya's pager went off, and according to her sister, she noted that it was her boyfriend and she had to call him back. She quickly walked down the bleachers and exited the school gym, heading towards a bank of payphones outside. After being gone for several minutes, LaTonya returned and explained that she was going to head out. Her boyfriend wanted to see her, and she was going over to his house to hang out for a while. Before parting, LaTonya told her sister that she'd give her a call later that night. Neither one of them could have ever imagined that this would be the last time they'd ever see one another. Several hours later, Lolita received a page from her sister. At approximately 11 p.m., the 2 chatted on the phone just as they had made plans to earlier. According to Lolita, her sister was trying to convince her to go out to a local club, Heroes, in Eatonville, north of Orlando and approximately 13 miles from the family's Casa Grande drive home. According to Lolita, while the 2 sisters were getting along well, she could detect some tension on the other line, specifically coming from LaTonya's boyfriend. She later explained to NBC News, saying, quote, "She said, 'Do you want to go and hang out with me at Heroes?' And when she said that, the boyfriend was in the background, and he asked her in like a violent way, 'Who are you talking to?' And she was like, 'This is my sister.'" End quote. Now, according to early reports, this was not the only call LaTonya made that night to one of her sisters. Initial statements suggest that in addition to inviting Lolita out to the club, LaTonya spoke to one of her other sisters and discussed the possibility of going to see a movie together. Orange County Sheriff spokesman Carlos Espinosa would later alert the media that LaTonya was last known to be en route to a local movie theater, though no specific location was ever actually given. Regardless, what we know beyond the shadow of a doubt is that this Friday is the last time anyone in LaTonya's family would ever hear from her. In December of 1994, LaTonya was 22 years old, and despite the ability to live in her own place, she stayed with her family in South Orlando. The video camera that she had used that night was later found back at the house, which investigators note as evidence that the 22-year-old had stopped back home after the basketball game, but prior to traveling to her boyfriend's house. Since she had told Lolita she was going to her boyfriend's, and because his voice was heard on the 11 p.m. call, it was therefore generally accepted as fact that LaTonya made it to her boyfriend's place that night. What exactly happened in the hours after 11 p.m., however, remains at the core of this mystery, approaching nearly 3 decades without any answers. Since LaTonya still lived at home, it didn't take long for her sisters to become aware that she never came home Friday night. While that wasn't entirely out of the ordinary, she was an adult woman free to come and go as she pleased, it was a bit odd that they hadn't heard from her throughout the next day. When evening came around on Saturday the 17th, marking a full 24 hours since she had been seen, her sisters started to worry. After making several calls to friends and family members, they couldn't find anyone who had seen or spoken with LaTonya since that Friday night. Not yet entirely panicked, they saw no reason to assume the worst yet. They didn't know what to do, though. Adding complications to the situation was the fact that their parents, Virgil and Ernestine, were out of town on a church mission trip and wouldn't return until Sunday. As a result, Saturday would come and go without any contact from or sightings of LaTonya. By the time Sunday rolled around, her sisters were teetering on the edge. It was one thing to go all of Saturday without a call or a page, but 2 days without contact wasn't just unusual, it was cause for concern, especially when you considered that LaTonya was exceedingly dedicated to her job. She wasn't likely to stay out all weekend when she needed to get up early on Monday for work. It was out of character, and more than that, it was legitimately frightening. When LaTonya's parents arrived home Sunday morning, their daughters explained the situation, and they too quickly found themselves overwhelmed with worry. They started making calls, but couldn't find anyone who had seen or spoken to LaTonya. Finally, they rang her boyfriend, the person she was last known to be visiting. When he claimed to have not seen or spoken to LaTonya since Friday night, that worry transformed into full-blown hysteria. Lolita recalled the phone call, later saying, quote, "He said, 'She's not home. I haven't seen your sister, and she's not here.' We started to worry because we know that something bad had to have happened." End quote. In hopes of tracking down LaTonya, her family decided to split up and cover areas where she might have been going. The 2 primary locations selected to take a look at were the movie theater she may have been heading to and Club Heroes. A pass through the theater yielded no signs of LaTonya nor her car, a white 4-door 1988 Toyota Corolla. However, Virgil's drive down to the club did prove useful. Club Heroes was, at the time, located at 426 East Kennedy Boulevard in Eatonville. The building, an eye-catching shade of melon red, still stands today and is under new management known as Club Koha. Upon arriving at the club, Virgil saw no sign of his daughter, and with it being early on a Sunday, there wasn't anyone available yet for him to speak to. The club is located on the corner of East Kennedy Boulevard and West Street, right where the northern and southern stretches meet. Passing by the club, Virgil proceeded west along Kennedy Boulevard for approximately a half mile until he found his daughter's car. The vehicle was located in a parking spot not far from the corner of East Kennedy and Wymore Road, which runs parallel to the I-4 interstate. Upon approaching the car, Virgil found the vehicle locked and the security system armed. There were no signs of violence or of anyone breaking into the car, although one tire was flat. When police later processed the car, they didn't find any traces of foreign objects inside of the tire, and so they could never determine if it had been flattened due to normal use or if someone had purposefully done this to disable LaTonya's vehicle. Investigators would later describe the car as being found under suspicious circumstances. At this point, investigators realized that this was more than just a missing persons case. While they had no solid evidence to suggest that LaTonya had been the victim of a crime, they also possessed nothing which would lead them to believe that her disappearance was self-imposed. They dug deep into her life, and what they ultimately found was that the 22-year-old was doing well. She was liked, had a group of friends, a tight-knit family, a great job with bosses who sung her praises, and a decent amount of money in her savings account. She hadn't given anyone any indication that she was planning on going anywhere, and if there was one thing her family could say with absolute certainty, it was that LaTonya would have kept in contact with her sisters no matter where she was, so long as she had the ability to do so. Unfortunately, this presented a major obstacle for police. They had a missing woman with almost no evidence to suggest what might have happened. There were no witnesses, no sightings, no reports of cries for help or a woman running. When they managed to speak with employees at Heroes, they learned another disturbing detail. Not a single person, whether employee or patron, had any memory of seeing LaTonya at the club that Friday night. In fact, outside of her asking one of her sisters if she wanted to go to the club, there was no evidence that she'd ever been there at all. Investigators began wondering if LaTonya had run into trouble walking the half-mile from her car to the club. But then, a significant detail was pointed out by the family, and this made detectives wonder if LaTonya had even been the one driving her car that last Friday night. LaTonya was a petite woman who stood no more than 4 feet 11 inches tall. As a result of her height, it wasn't always the easiest for her to drive. According to friends and family, in order to give herself the extra height she wanted, LaTonya would pull the driver's seat as far forward as was possible, and then while driving, she would be seated on a thick blue cushion for a boost. However, when the car was found, the driver's seat was stated to have been pushed all the way back, suggesting that a taller person had been the last to drive it. In addition to this, that familiar blue cushion was sitting on the passenger seat. This was highly out of the ordinary, as that cushion never left the driver's seat. Whether or not LaTonya drove her car to the spot it was later found has never been determined. However, investigators have stated they find the circumstances suspicious, and it's generally theorized that someone else was driving, at least when the car was left. Perhaps the more pertinent question is whether or not LaTonya was a passenger in her own car that night, and if so, why hadn't this last person to see her alive come forward yet? Detectives were clear with the local media. While they had no solid evidence to conclude foul play was involved, there really wasn't any other possibility. LaTonya wasn't the type to just run off, and even if she was, she'd have gotten in touch with a family member by now. Unfortunately, detectives acknowledged that without more information, without additional evidence, they had little to work with. Everyone they had spoken with struggled to come up with anyone who might want to harm LaTonya, leading them to believe that her assailant was likely a stranger or perhaps someone on the periphery of her social circle. That would all change, though, when her sisters revealed a dark and disturbing secret to their parents and investigators. According to the family, the last months of LaTonya's life were filled with stress, trauma, and pain. Her relationship with her boyfriend was described as rocky at best, though for the most part, family and friends didn't shy away from acknowledging that LaTonya was the victim of domestic abuse, both physical and emotional. The 22-year-old kept extensive notes about her life in her diary, daily planner, and on her calendar. She wrote about being physically assaulted by her then boyfriend and the trauma she suffered at his hands. In these writings, she also noted that she had sought assistance from a therapist whom she was now seeing regularly. However, it was a nightmare experience LaTonya chose not to write about, which would ultimately cause police to change her status from missing to missing endangered. According to her sisters, in November of 1994, approximately 1 month before she mysteriously disappeared, LaTonya was asleep when her boyfriend shook her awake. After a short conversation, she agreed to get into his car and take a ride. Reportedly, the boyfriend proceeded on to the I-4 interstate and began traveling southwest out of Orange County. They would travel to Haines City, located approximately 40 miles from Orlando in rural Polk County. This area is known for being home to countless citrus groves. According to LaTonya's sisters, after driving around the area, the boyfriend pulled over and forced her out of the car at gunpoint. He held the gun to her back and made her walk forward, deeper into the grove. He eventually shouted for her to stop, and she did instantly. Scared for her life and trembling, she wondered if she'd make it home alive. What the exact conversation was has never been revealed, though it's quite clear that LaTonya's boyfriend was in a rage about something, and in his anger, he gestured towards a small, human-sized hole he had dug in the grove. He ordered LaTonya to stand there, on the edge of that hole, staring down into the darkness of the open earth. According to her sisters, LaTonya's boyfriend was extremely upset about an argument the two had had previously, and in the middle of the night, standing in the citrus grove, he made it adequately clear. If LaTonya ever upset him like that again, he'd put her in that hole, and no one, not her family, not the police, no one would ever find her. Hearing this horrifying story, investigators weren't sure what to think. They now realized the scope of the case, the extent of this odious nightmare LaTonya had to endure at the hands of her boyfriend. Of course, the question remained, had the boyfriend made good on his earlier threat and killed LaTonya, dumping her body in a hole somewhere in a citrus grove? Or was it possible the 22-year-old, despite walking on eggshells in an abusive and violent relationship, might have been the victim of a random crime perpetrated by someone she ran into that night, someone at the club, or maybe someone from the outer fringes of her social circle? While you'd imagine that would be an easy question to answer, I wouldn't be asking it 29 years later if that were the case. Now, as an aside, I think it's worth mentioning here, we really have no idea how extensive the investigation into LaTonya's boyfriend was. Hell, in the nearly 3 decades that have passed since she disappeared, not even so much as his name has been shared publicly. All I can really tell you is that in one interview, detectives said outside of denying knowledge of LaTonya's whereabouts, the boyfriend refused to cooperate further. I've got to be honest, this is one of the very rare instances in which it sounds like there is one person, one primary figure who was both close to the victim and had previously threatened her, but we know nothing more than that. Of course, you have to consider the story about the citrus grove comes from LaTonya's sisters and therefore is hearsay, and as such may not provide police with what they need to move forward. Of course, it has been nearly 30 years, but I digress. Orange County homicide detectives Linnert and Nazarchuk, in hopes of finding something to keep the investigation alive, began the difficult and time-consuming process of examining citrus groves within proximity to Haines City in Polk County. They ran into just one problem. Polk County is known as being the heart of citrus country, and as you might expect, there are vast swaths of land dedicated to citrus groves, leaving them searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack. Despite the seemingly overwhelming odds, the detectives decided to try anyway. They walked through groves searching for signs of disturbed earth or freshly filled in holes. They hovered over them in helicopters trying to spot anything that stood out. They spent countless hours searching through endless spans of dirt and dust between orange trees, never to find anything. It had been a nearly insurmountable task to begin with, but in the aftermath, they had to admit they had hoped they'd win against the odds and find something, some trace, some new clue, but they left empty-handed. I would love to tell you more. I'd like to tell you there was a breakthrough, new evidence, leads, but I can't. Despite the passage of just a few months, the investigation into LaTonya's disappearance grew cold rapidly. Investigators ran down their leads and they ran them out. Obviously, the boyfriend is an avenue that would warrant further investigation, but given the lack of any developments over the years and the choice to never name this man publicly, it's difficult to maintain any type of optimism there. The last update on this case, and I use the term loosely, came in June of 2020 when it was announced that the case was getting a new look from new investigators. Sergeant Ben Thorpe was brought on to look at the case. He managed the Domestic Violence and Missing Persons Unit for the Orange County Sheriff's Office with a total crew of 6. Then there was also Sergeant Gloria Morris, who had some success working cold missing persons cases previously. Both of them agreed, despite a lack of evidence, that this was being investigated as a case of foul play. Unfortunately, not much came from new eyes being on the case as, years later, they are still seeking answers and hoping to speak with anyone who has information about this case or who saw LaTonya that Friday or afterwards. Despite a lack of developments, LaTonya's family refuses to give up the hope that someday they will bring her home and see justice done to the person or persons responsible for her disappearance. One fact about this case simply cannot be denied. Someone out there knows what happened, and more than likely, it's more than one person. Scumbags love to talk about their nightmarish exploits. Someone has the ability to come forward and end the torture of limbo for LaTonya's family and friends that they have had to endure for nearly 30 years. When last seen, LaTonya Diane Roberts was described as being a black female with brown eyes and her brown hair done in braids. LaTonya is 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighed approximately 90 pounds at the time of her disappearance. Her ears are pierced, and she was last believed to have been wearing a black leather jacket, a fuchsia-colored flower print shirt, purple stretch pants, black boots, and possibly an Oak Ridge High School class ring 1989-1990. She may also have been carrying a brown Dooney and Burke purse. At the time of her disappearance, LaTonya was driving a white 4-door 1988 Toyota Corolla, which was recovered Sunday, December 18th, from a parking space near the former Club Heroes. The car was found near the intersection of East Kennedy Boulevard and Wymore Road. At the time of her disappearance, LaTonya was 22, and if alive today, she would be celebrating her 51st birthday next month. For nearly 30 years, LaTonya's family has been haunted by the unknown, whether she is alive and being held captive or dead and perhaps buried somewhere in a citrus grove or elsewhere. They are desperate for the answers, for the opportunity to grieve, for the chance to bring LaTonya home where she might be laid to rest and properly memorialized. For a family as close as they are, it is an overwhelming challenge to imagine never finding the truth and never bringing her home. Asked about her sister all these years later, Lolita replied, quote, "It's a daily thing of having her on my mind and me having to ride through and say, if I had just gone out with her, this would have never happened. It would have never happened. I don't see how you can live. I don't see how you can go to bed at night knowing that you know something and not say anything about it. Any information is valuable on her case. We just want closure. We want to know what happened to my sister. Not knowing where she is or what happened to her. It's just all these unanswered questions." What do you do with a case where it seems so obvious what happened, but not a single scrap of solid evidence exists to allow you to move forward? You've got a missing woman, but no real indication that a crime was committed. No body, no blood, no crime scene. Sure, they found her car and they worked it over as best they could, but it doesn't sound like they obtained any solid forensic evidence, let alone any evidence at all. What they got at the end of the day was a blue seat cushion and an adjusted driver's seat. That seat, pushed all the way back and the cushion being in the wrong place, certainly seems to suggest that someone other than LaTonya parked her car on East Kennedy Boulevard. But that's it. No reports of fingerprints, blood, any kind of indication of who might have been driving or why LaTonya was targeted, What could have led to her disappearance? In those early hours and days of the investigation, detectives faced a blank slate with little idea of how to fill it in. They dug into her life and found what people told them was true. LaTonya was a smart woman. She had a good head on her shoulders. She was friendly and polite, loving and kind. She made friends with ease, and she was remarkably close with her sisters and parents in whose house she still lived. She saved her money, paid her bills, maintained her car, and spent much of her free time with her sisters or her boyfriend. On the surface, everything seems on the level, and that makes it all the more difficult for detectives. It's not so easy to figure out who might want to harm someone who, by all accounts, was an absolutely delightful person to know. So, the cops do the usual. They start interviewing family, then friends, then coworkers. They try to speak to everyone who ever encountered LaTonya for more than a casual chat. They work on putting together a timeline of events, and what they find is that after 11 p.m. on Friday, December 16th, they can't find a single person who spoke with or saw LaTonya. Her last form of contact came in a call to her sister, during which time she asked if she was interested in going to Heroes, a club in Eatonville just north of Orlando. Whether or not she ever made it to the club is another source of debate in this case. Her father, Virgil, found her car parked approximately half a mile west of the club. The doors were locked, the alarm was set, and there was no sign of violence or forced entry. One tire was flat, though it was never determined if this was due to running something over in the normal course of her day or if it was sabotage, perhaps to ensure that she couldn't make the drive home that night. Then again, given the positioning of the driver's seat, we really don't know for certain that she drove her car at all after 11 o'clock that night. So then what are you left with? A young woman goes missing and there's nothing, as if she'd fallen off the face of the earth. No witnesses, sightings, reports of a woman crying for help, of someone parking the car and running off. There's just nothing at all. LaTonya goes missing, and it's as if everything falls into the void after that. While there was a lot of activity on the case in the early going, within months things have grown cold and detectives are reporting that they've run down all of their leads and there's simply no answers to be found. Rewards are offered. LaTonya's family goes above and beyond to keep the story alive and in the papers. But without developments, without something more sensational, they find the media disinterested. They'd be happy to write countless articles should a body be found, but for a missing person with not much to go on, God forbid they try to help out before things get too horrible. You wouldn't want to waste any advertising space now, would you? Then comes the story, the one that turns the case on its head. LaTonya's sisters go to her parents, who in turn go to the police. Her sisters tell the horrifying story of a night when her life almost came to an end at the hands of her violent and abusive boyfriend. She's rousted from her bed and convinced to get into a car. Over the course of a 30-minute drive, she sits in stunned silence as the implication of the journey begins settling in. At some point, the vehicle pulls over and she's forced out at gunpoint. She's walked into a citrus grove, a gun against her back, until she stands on the edge of a small hole. The man wielding the gun, her boyfriend, screams at her, threatens her, warns her that if she continues to push him, upset him, anger him, this is where her life will end. In a small hole in the middle of a citrus grove surrounded by miles and miles of farmland. She'll never be found, he assures her, and they'll never be able to pin the crime on him. This was yet another horrifying stop along the way, as LaTonya suffered through the emotional and physical abuse her then boyfriend rained down on her. It sounds, to the outsider, that the bright, talented, and loving young woman with a good head on her shoulders found herself in the clutches of a violent predator who wasn't going to let her just walk away. Now, when LaTonya Roberts goes missing a month after this alleged incident, all signs seem to point towards him. The problem is, nothing comes of it. While LaTonya kept track of much of the nightmare she lived while in that relationship, she didn't write about the citrus grove. She didn't tell her parents about it. She didn't file a police report. She told her sisters. She told a close friend. She kept the rest to herself. That speaks volumes about the fear she lived in while in a relationship with this man, who I tend to think of as an abusive scumbag. Regardless of whether or not he was involved in LaTonya's disappearance, it's quite apparent that he was a piece of trash, violent prick who was light years behind LaTonya in every way imaginable. A weak, cowardly abuser who made himself feel like a man by threatening a woman at gunpoint. Wow, what a tough guy, huh? Unfortunately, as it currently stands, there's really no way to go forward. The story of what happened in that citrus grove is disturbing, emotionally evocative, powerful. It depicts a woman who should have been thriving in the prime of her life, but instead was standing in the shadow of a monster who had no hesitation about harming her, threatening her, and maybe even killing her. Now, if you're like me, you're sitting there banging your hands on your desk, wondering how in the hell this guy managed to escape prosecution. And I'd argue that answer comes from a few different avenues, but most primarily, the sheer lack of evidence. The Citrus Grove story is compelling, but there's nothing to back it up. There's no physical evidence, there's no third-party witnesses, and LaTonya chose not to write about it. That leaves it in the sort of gray space that is hearsay. While it might give investigators a good idea of what happened, it doesn't provide them with anything that can be used as leverage. So they go to the boyfriend, and they ask him about it, and he denies it. And there's really not much else they can do because they don't have any solid evidence. It's not a great place to find yourself as a detective. All signs point in one direction, all roads lead to the same place, but you can't go there. You don't have the evidence to make an arrest. You can't force the boyfriend to sit down for an interview, so you're stuck hoping that you can find something that clicks, or that he'll make a mistake, or that someone will come forward and provide you with the information necessary to jumpstart the case. But it never happens. I can't imagine detectives ever took their eyes off of this guy, but in the nearly 30 years that have passed, he apparently hasn't done anything to give them an opportunity to find new information or evidence. Hell, neither the police nor the family has ever publicly stated his name, so it makes it more difficult to figure out what was going on, what type of person he was, what violent or criminal incidents he may or may not have been involved with in the past 29 years since LaTonya went missing. Now, in all fairness, just because this guy was an abusive scumbag doesn't necessarily mean he's a killer. You can be a total garbage human being without ever killing anyone. Certainly, the information is compelling. The details about the relationship and the story about that night in the citrus grove is difficult to ignore. But no matter how many times you read it, it's not going to solve this case. Evidence moves cases. Witnesses bring investigations back to life. Facts connect the dots. Everything that is needed to solve this case already exists. Her assailant is out there. More than likely, he's told someone about what he did. Neither I nor investigators have any doubts that there are people in the Orlando area to this day who know exactly what happened that night. It's just a matter of coming forward because whether they want to admit it or not, those people who know what happened to LaTonya have the ability to end nearly 3 decades of suffering, grief, and pain. Her family has never been able to properly grieve her loss. It's hard to say goodbye when you don't even know what happened, when you don't even know where your sister, your daughter, is. I can't begin to imagine how impossible it is to close your eyes and fall asleep when you don't know where your loved one is, when you can't find some comfort and security in knowing that they're all right. LaTonya went missing at 22 years old. She hadn't even begun her life. 22 is nothing. It's infancy. It's a slight dent in the world. Yet she did so much with those 22 years. She looked out for her family, started an amazing career, made lifelong friends, and spread love and care to everyone she could. And then, in a moment of violent madness, she was taken away. No goodbye, no answers, no explanation. She's just gone. LaTonya Roberts has now been missing for 7 years more than she was ever known to be alive. Her sisters, with whom she was so close, have tried to move on with their lives, but there's nothing that can ever fill the tremendous hole left by the loss of a beloved sibling. Whoever took LaTonya away didn't just destroy her life. He threw darkness and pain into the lives of everyone who ever knew and loved her. Her parents, strong in their faith, turned to God in part because there was nowhere else to turn. How do you confront the reality of losing a child when you can't even be sure what became of that child? You have no grave to visit, no site to memorialize, no last words to cling to. You're left with a cold vacancy that can never be filled. If someone were to come forward today, it wouldn't bring LaTonya back. It wouldn't end her family's suffering, but it might give them the ability to obtain some sense of closure, to find some relief in bringing her home and laying her to rest with her family. All it takes is one call, one text, one anonymous message. So please, come forward with what you know, because in all honesty, without some new evidence, someone calling in a tip, or the discovery of LaTonya herself, this case will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information on the disappearance of LaTonya Roberts, it is honestly difficult to find. For this episode, the Orlando Sentinel and My News 13 were the most helpful, but in truth, there is a major lack of coverage. If you have any information about the disappearance of LaTonya Roberts, please contact the Orange County Sheriff's Department at 407-254-7200. LaTonya's case number is 944-10517. You can also submit information anonymously to Orlando Crime Stoppers by calling 1-800-423-8477 or by visiting their website at crimeline.org. As a final note, if you are a member of LaTonya's family, a close friend, or someone who worked on her case, I would really love to speak with you so that we can flesh this episode out even more. I made several attempts to get in touch with members of the family, but was unsuccessful. So please, if you knew LaTonya, if you know a member of her family, or if you are one, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. She deserves a much more detailed episode covering her story. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank some of our amazing Patreon producers. Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Alicia Lorraine, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Dirthy, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eloanne Meyer, Guillermo Pinto, Jennifer Winkler, Julie Mangano, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Kelly Michelle, Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Lisa Hobson, Madison Mahulier, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Nicole Kingbird, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Eve, Stephanie Joyner, and Tom Radford. I can't begin to express just how much all of your support means to me, as without all of you, Trace Evidence would not be possible. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes, for the moment, our look into the 1994 disappearance of LaTonya Roberts. I really hope to be able to get in touch with her family and some folks close to the case so that we can do a much more in-depth episode. Her case has always disturbed me, in part because it seems so solvable. So, once again, I apologize about my sick voice this week, and there will be 2 episodes coming out this week, one of them being an update. So, Thank you again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.